take a second and look away from your phone. Actually, don't, because you're staring at this video right now and that's exactly where I need you. Just picture what I'm describing while the words are still rolling. You're standing on a beach in New Jersey, except it isn't really New Jersey, not the New Jersey on any map you've ever opened. The shoreline you know is 60 miles behind you, swallowed by water that used to be dry grassland. Somewhere out past where your eyes can see, fishermen are about to haul up a net that's going to make their entire week. And it has nothing to do with fish. What comes up in that net is heavy, waterlogged, and roughly the size of a brick, and it is absolutely not anything that belongs in the ocean. It's a mammoth's tooth, dredged from water 200 feet deep, 60 miles off the modern coast. This isn't folklore or some shaky legend passed around by old sailors. Fishing boats off the Atlantic coast have hauled up mammoth and mastodon remains for over a century, enough of them that museums keep entire drawers full of teeth that came up tangled in nets meant for scallops. That mammoth did not swim out there for fun, and it definitely didn't fall off a passing ship. It walked there. On solid ground. Ground that is currently somewhere underneath several container ships and a whole lot of confused cod. Here's the unglamorous science behind that: no ghosts required. Around 20,000 years ago, ice sheets piled up across Canada and the northern half of what's now the United States, in places stacked over a mile high, and all that frozen water had to come from somewhere. It came straight out of the ocean, which dropped global sea level by roughly 400 feet compared to where it sits today. That's not a small adjustment to the map. That's an entirely different coastline. Florida wasn't the narrow flip-flop-shaped peninsula you know from spring break photos. It was nearly double the width, a flat sprawl of dry grassland stretching out into what tourists currently consider excellent snorkeling water. The beach you'd visit on vacation simply did not exist yet, because it was busy being normal, dry, walkable land. It gets stranger off the coast of Alabama, where divers stumbled onto something that sounds made up even though it's thoroughly real. 60 feet down, sitting in the mud of the Gulf of Mexico, is an entire buried forest of bald cypress trees, trunks still rooted exactly where they grew, preserved for tens of thousands of years by mud, cold water, and a near-total absence of oxygen. A hurricane eventually scoured the sediment away and exposed it, like the ocean had been hiding a secret it finally got tired of keeping. Divers who swim through it say the wood still smells like fresh-cut cypress, which is an unsettling thing to learn about something older than the pyramids by a wide margin. Stand on a Gulf Coast beach today and you are roughly standing where the edge of that forest used to begin. The forest itself is now a scuba diving attraction. You, meanwhile, are standing in a parking lot, possibly holding a daiquiri. Up near Alaska, the scale gets even more ridiculous. The land bridge linking Siberia to North America, the one your high school textbook drew as a thin little strip of land like a hallway between two rooms, was actually a sprawling subcontinent hundreds of miles wide, with its own grasslands, its own rivers, and its own weather system that doesn't exist anywhere on the planet anymore. People crossed it. Entire families, entire generations, walking across ground that had never been mapped, following herds of animals into a continent nobody back home would ever see again. They built lives there. They had names for rivers and hills that no longer have a name, because the people who named them are long gone and the land itself is now somewhere under the Bering Sea. None of that made it into any history book because it happened before anyone was writing things down. Here's the thing that should really mess with your head. Those people walking across that drowned land bridge with their kids and their fire and their handmade tools were not walking into an empty continent waiting quietly for them. They were walking straight into the most insane wildlife situation North America has ever hosted, before or since, a place crawling with animals so large and so genuinely bizarre that modern nature documentaries would not know what to do with them. We are talking sloths the size of pickup trucks, bears that could outrun a horse, and birds with wingspans wider than your living room. None of that is a typo. I am not exaggerating a single one of those, and in the next part I'm going to prove it. Stick around, because this is the part where prehistoric America stops sounding like a boring textbook chapter and starts sounding like something that should require a waiver. Picture walking along a riverbank somewhere in what is now Kentucky, minding your business, gathering firewood. The brush ahead of you stops moving the normal way. Then it starts moving like something enormous is in there. What steps out is not a bear, not anything you have a name for yet. It is roughly the size of a pickup truck, covered in coarse fur with claws the length of kitchen knives. And it is looking at you with the same mild, unbothered expression a cow gives a fence post. This is a giant ground sloth, and despite looking like it could end your entire bloodline in one swipe, it almost certainly just wants to eat a tree. Almost certainly. Ground sloths were so big and so strange that when their bones turned up in a Virginia cave in the late 1700s, Thomas Jefferson himself got personally involved. He was convinced the claws belonged to some kind of giant lion still roaming the unexplored parts of the continent. He was wrong about the lion part. But a founding father personally hyping up a mystery predator based on fossil claws is, frankly, the most American origin story a sloth could ever ask for. The species eventually got named partly after him, Megalonyx jeffersonii, which means he has a giant prehistoric sloth named in his honor and most people don't even know it. Somewhere there's a trivia night this would absolutely win. The sloths themselves stood up on their hind legs to strip leaves off branches 12 feet up, bracing on their tails like a tripod, which is a genuinely strange way to eat dinner if you stop and actually picture it. Sloths were the slow, mostly harmless end of the spectrum. The short-faced bear was not. Standing on its hind legs, it could look a basketball player dead in the eye and then keep growing from there. Unlike the slow, shuffling bears you're picturing right now, this thing had long, almost deer-like legs built for covering serious ground fast. Researchers estimate it could have outrun a racehorse over a short sprint, which means the scariest thing in Ice Age Kentucky was not just enormous, it was quick. There was nowhere on the open plain you were realistically outrunning it, and it likely spent a fair amount of its time simply walking up to other predators and stealing their kills, because when you're that large and that fast, negotiation is optional. There's a part of this story hiding in plain sight under a major American city right now. In Los Angeles, underneath parking lots, palm trees and a famous art museum, sit the La Brea tar pits, sticky asphalt seeps that have been quietly trapping animals for tens of thousands of years. Saber-toothed cats with canine teeth as long as steak knives got stuck going after herbivores who got stuck first, then more predators got stuck going after them, in a horrible chain reaction frozen in tar for archaeologists to dig up centuries later. Giant condor-like birds called teratorns, with wingspans pushing 12 feet across, scavenged the mess from above and sometimes joined the pile themselves. Dire wolves, the real prehistoric ones and not the fictional kind, hunted there in packs of dozens. Their bones are now the single most common large mammal fossil pulled out of the tar. Los Angeles traffic is bad, sure, but it has never once in recorded history been this bad. Here's the twist that tends to make people physically stop and reread it. Horses evolved in North America. So did camels. Both species originated right here and thrived here for millions of years before going completely extinct on this continent around the same time everything else did. They only survived at all because earlier waves of them had already wandered across that frozen land bridge into Asia and beyond, long before the rest stayed behind and vanished. The horses that cowboys would later ride across those exact same plains, the camels people now pay to ride at desert tourist attractions, are the literal descendants of animals that disappeared from American soil. They only came back centuries later, on European ships, completely unaware they were just visiting their actual hometown. So somewhere around 13,000 years ago, give or take, all of it goes quiet. The sloths, the short-faced bears, the dire wolves, the teratorns, the native horses and camels, gone. Not gradually over some comfortable stretch of deep time, but within a window that is, geologically speaking, basically an afternoon. Scientists still argue over exactly why. Climate swinging hard at the end of the Ice Age, human hunters arriving with spears and a taste for big game, or some brutal combination of both stacking on top of each other at the worst possible moment. But whatever finished the job didn't just kill animals, it drained entire lakes the size of small countries and rerouted rivers across half a continent. It left scars so massive you can still see the outlines from an airplane window. We're going there next, and some of those scars are about to make everything in this part look almost normal. Start in North Dakota, except picture it underwater because for a few thousand years it basically was. At the edge of the melting ice sheet sat a lake called Agassiz, and lake barely covers it. At its biggest, it held more water than all 5 Great Lakes combined, stretching across Minnesota, North Dakota, and a huge slice of central Canada. Most of it is gone today, drained down to leftovers like Lake Winnipeg and Lake of the Woods, polite reminders of something that once swallowed an entire region. When Agassiz finally broke loose and emptied out all at once, some researchers think that meltwater flood disrupted Atlantic currents badly enough to trigger a sudden cold snap across the whole hemisphere. One lake, draining in a geological blink, possibly chilled half the planet. Try complaining about your local weather after that. Out in Washington state, the evidence is even harder to miss because you can still drive through it. The region is called the Channeled Scablands, gouged with canyons, dry waterfalls, and ripple marks the size of office buildings that don't match the gentle little rivers running through there now. For decades, geologists assumed it took millions of years of slow erosion to carve, the polite, textbook explanation. Then a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz looked at the same rock and said no, this happened almost instantly, in a catastrophic flood unlike anything in recorded history. His colleagues laughed him out of conferences for roughly 40 years. Then satellite imagery and further digging proved him right. Repeated, biblical-scale floods, unleashed each time a glacial lake burst its own ice dam. Brett's lived long enough to be formally vindicated, which has to be one of the most satisfying plot twists in the history of science. Head south to Utah and the story gets stranger still. Where you now see the blinding white nothing of the Bonneville Salt Flats, there used to be a lake and not a small one. At its deepest, ancient Lake Bonneville was deeper than 200 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. This is the same desert where people now strap rockets to cars to break land speed records. When that ancient lake finally breached its own natural rim, the flood scoured a canyon clean through present-day Idaho and sent a wall of water roaring toward the Pacific. What's left behind is the Great Salt Lake, a shrunken, salty leftover of something unimaginably larger. A flat, cracked lakebed where humans now go specifically to drive as fast as physically possible across the floor of a vanished sea. None of this happened in some special, isolated silence either. The night sky above all of it would have looked nothing like the orange smear most of us call stars today. With zero artificial light for thousands of miles, the Milky Way wasn't a faint suggestion. It was a thick, structured river of light splitting the sky in half, bright enough on a clear night to cast an actual shadow on the ground. Underneath that sky, the world stayed loud too, just wind, water, and animal calls drifting across open country. It was also somehow quieter than anywhere you have ever personally stood, the kind of total quiet that lets you hear a predator's footsteps from 100 yards out, no traffic, no hum, no notifications buzzing in anyone's pocket. Plenty of indigenous oral traditions across North America include stories about the world flooding, about giant animals roaming the land long before people arrived, about landscapes shifting dramatically within memory. Researchers studying these traditions are careful, and so should we be, because turning every old story into a literal weather report is its own kind of disrespect. But the broader pattern is hard to dismiss completely. Real lakes really did vanish almost overnight. Real animals really did disappear within a handful of generations. Real coastlines really did move while people were alive to watch it happen, and somebody had to be standing there when it did. So here's where this leaves you. Everything under your feet right now, the highway you drove on, the lake you swim in every summer, the salt flat someone is currently speeding across in a custom rocket car, all of it sits directly on top of a version of the world that vanished almost completely. Bigger lakes, stranger animals, a sky and a silence nobody alive today has ever actually experienced. We didn't lose it to one dramatic catastrophe with a name and a date attached. We lost it slowly, one drained lake and one missing species at a time, until it slipped out of memory and started sounding more like myth than history. The ground itself remembers more than we do. We just finally started asking it the right questions.